Hey everyone, and welcome back to the second devlog of my puzzle game. I wanted to start this devlog by talking about where the last video left us all off at. The last devlog left us with basic character movement and camera properties. In this devlog, we've got some pretty big things to unpack, so let's get started. The first big thing from the last video was the cameras. Next up is some fundamental character movement and abilities. The biggest thing to tackle was ladders. Ladders are an important piece of this game's arsenal because the character will not be allowed to jump. Ladders will be very important for any type of vertical movement. Before starting, I wanted to come up with a basic understanding of how this would work. There were 3 steps I needed to take. First, player detection, then movement, and lastly, animations. The first step was how I detect when the camera is quote-unquote on the ladder. I came up with 3 possible paths, but in the end I got very off track as per usual and ended up with 2 initial ideas. These were raycasting and collisions. Let me break down each of these options. The first is raycasting. This basically shoots an invisible line in front of the player to detect what is in front of it, behind it, side it, any direction you want. This works well for projectile detection and things that are moving because they are more accurate than normal colliders. The other option, of course, was just plain colliders. This was the best option because I could easily use the on-trigger enter and on-trigger exit functions. Once I figured this out, my next step was to figure out how to handle these on-trigger enter and exit functions. I decided to implement Unity's event system to handle this. I used an awesome tutorial by Thousand Ants on a custom event system to achieve this. He explains the system very well and in depth. It is an easy way to handle code events like when blank happens, do this block of code. Okay, now that I can easily detect when the player is on and off the ladder, I need to handle the motion of the ladder. My first thought was to move the player in between each ladder rung point. I easily witnessed how clunky and buggy this was, so I had to switch some perspective because the rungs were just too close together that it became very buggy for the engine to interpolate the values. In the end, I just used Unity's vertical axis in order to find out how hard I'm pressing down the keys or for how long, and to use this to move the player up and down until the player exited the collider rather than moving in between multiple points. Now I notice wherever the player entered the collider is where they stayed and locked the character movement. For example, if you entered on the side of the ladder, you would only move up and down on the side of the ladder. I wanted the player to snap to the center of the ladder to make it look more realistic. At first I thought using do tween, but this did not mesh well with my character controller on my player. This led me to creating a custom function where I could pass in a point as a parameter and have the player move to that point. That was very easy, but it would randomly get buggy very fast for no apparent reason. There were so many unexpected results that I began to get very frustrated. I took a break for a little bit and decided to switch my focus to a different part of the game in order to get my mind off the ladders. I took a break from the ladders and finished something more simple. I wanted to tell where the player was if they were behind a wall or obstacle. At this moment, if the camera was blocking or in the way, you couldn't really see where the player was. To solve this, I followed Bracky's tutorial on a custom renderer, and I got the result I wanted pretty fast. It's just a gray outline on the player whenever he is behind anything. Now that I was a little more motivated, I switched focus back to some harder stuff and back to the ladders to see what progress I could make, and eventually got it starting to work a little better. This was the ending result. Well, it was all well and good. I need to actually get some player animations in. Let's just say my Unity animation knowledge is practically 0. I tried to get some IKs working, but it was just a mess. This is where I decided to hold off any integration between my art and my code until all the mechanics were fleshed out. Better to keep them separate for now. The next task at hand was actually pretty simple. I wanted to make a player able to push a block onto a pressure plate and have a door open in response. I used the custom event system I made earlier to trigger when the button has something on it or not. This came in really handy along with do tween, and it worked very well. Now that I have a very basic puzzle mechanic, push the block on the spot and the door opens. After that, the next easy task to knock out was a basic spell, the fireball. This would shoot from the player and detect what it hits. The first thing that I noticed is that it was very hard to aim. This led me to rethink how I wanted to handle this aspect of the game. Since my focus had been all over the place, I decided to switch my focus once again to finish off the camera from the last episode. I finally added damping to the camera, so that movement was more delayed when it started to track the player. The two crucial things that I missed on the camera in the last devlog was rotation clamping and zooming. The rotation clamping was pretty simple, just some boring code, and it worked like magic. Zooming was also pretty easy at first. I wanted the camera to have two modes, a regular one and a zoom one. The zoomed one would do exactly that, zoom in on the player. The goal was to have the pivot point of the camera change depending on what mode you were in. And that leads me to the last improvement I made. When I mentioned earlier that I wanted a weapon aiming to work different, this is what I had in mind. The player can enter an aiming mode where all time is slowed down. This gives the player the option to shoot at any of the glowing targets if they have line of sight. Then they can just click and it will shoot. It was easier than I expected, and with some coding magic, the fundamentals are working. That is where I am right now. If you liked the second episode of these devlogs, don't be afraid to hit the subscribe button. Hope you enjoyed and have a wonderful day.